You see absolutely nothing wrong in that at all.
If I can remind you, Mr. Winnock, the police were supposed to be investigating phone hacking between December 05 and I think January 07 when 2 people were convicted. As far as I was aware, that was a very successful investigation.
No, but on the 9th of July, you asked Mr. Yates to look at this again.
Yes.
And a few weeks later, Mr. Wallace was given his job. We accept that maybe there was no evidence, but you are a police officer with years of experience. Surely you'd think to yourself, it's very odd that former News International employees, one is working with the leader of the opposition, one is working with me. It's almost like a fashion accessory that people leave the News of the World and come and work for the police or politicians. And then your officers, like Andy Hayman, leave the police force and go and work for News International. You must have read some of Mr. Hayman's columns in the Times at some stage. Didn't you have any suspicions about this? I accept there was no hard evidence, but you're a police officer. Surely you would have had suspicions.
Mr. Vaz, there was no evidence available to me. No hard evidence. Secondly, Mr. Hayman was not in the Met when I was Commissioner. He was in the Met when I was Deputy Commissioner. And no, I don't read Mr. Hayman's columns. I've no need
You didn't know he worked for the Times?
Well, I know he works for the Times, but you asked me, don't I read his columns? No, I do not.
So
I'm sure he'll
no
be very
regrets.
upset to hear that.
Sorry,
Nicola
regrets,
Blackwood. Nicola Blackwood.
No regrets
I've no
regarding Mr. Wallace.
I've already said, now the information has come out, of course I regret the contract was taking on. Of course.
Nicola Blackwood.
Sir Paul, we read that Mr. Yates has been a close friend of Mr. Wallace for about 12 years. It's characterised in one newspaper that Yates thought Wallace was a fantastic guy, really one of the best journalists around. The strange thing is that Wallace was regarded as a monster by lots of people in the newsrooms he worked in, but Yates had the utmost respect for him. I just wonder if you feel that in some of the decisions that were made around the hacking inquiry, perhaps some of the personalities might have been blinded by friendship and some judgment might have been clouded because of relationships with News International journalists.
I genuinely have no reason to believe that. Of course, you have asked and you will be asking more questions of Mr. Yates. I have genuinely no reason to believe that. Mr. Clark was the first inquirer, a man of huge integrity. I had no reason to believe that that was not a successful investigation, and I had no reason to doubt the assurances given from Mr. Yates, and I have no reason to believe that his judgment was impaired. You have to ask Mr. Yates that, and I cannot characterise the nature of their friendship, or indeed the nature of what other people believe in Mr. Wallace. I'm not that close to him.
Blackwood?
But when we discussed Mr. Yates's assessment of the material in 2009, and we asked him if he felt that there was a need to do the minimum in order to get the review off his desk as quickly as possible and focus on more important things, he said that he thought that that probably was the case. And I just wonder to what extent it is possible that his relationship with a News International journalist might have coloured that judgment in some way, and to what extent you, knowing Mr. Yates, think that might have been possible.
I think I've answered that. Knowing Mr. Yates, I've got no reason to believe that whatsoever. I have a huge amount of faith in Mr. Yates, and I have no reason to believe that's the case.
Yes, we will be seeing him shortly. Quick questions from members, then we must move on to the investigation. Steve McCabe.
Sir Paul, I apologise for dwelling on Mr. Wallace, but you must see why it's become significant now. You told us that he was appointed because Mr. Fedorcio needed some short-term support. But he was appointed to work in specialist operations, the Director of Public Affairs and the Commissioner's Office to provide strategic communication advice and support. What was he there to do for you in your office?
He wasn't appointed to work in my office. He never worked in my office. I don't recall him ever coming into my office.
Fedorcio says that was one of the roles he was given. That's not true.
No, he was appointed to support Mr. Fedorcio and to give me occasional advice on speeches.
So,
thank you.
Occasional advice on speeches?
Well, speeches was the main thing.
That was all?
Well, not occasional advice on speeches, but it was very much about the media, and he didn't work in my office or directly to me.
We will explore this with Mr. Fedorcio. James Clapperson has a supplement.
You'll appreciate we have to ask you questions about what went wrong with the inquiry and the review. and you've been giving us a full account of what you knew when. But
I suspect that's why I'm here, sir.
yeah, indeed. But looking at it, did it not occur to you at the time, and this is a question which I think people would looking at this in the round, would see as an obvious question, knowing that Mr. Yates was a great friend of Neil Wallace, and known him for a long time, and that Neil Wallace had been the deputy editor of the News of the World at the time of the original phone hacking allegations, did you not think there might appear to be a conflict of interest between asking Mr. Yates to do the investigation at that point?
Several things there. Firstly, I've got to repeat, I had no reason to doubt. There was absolutely no reason for me to do that. So I knew Mr. Yates was a friend of Wallace, but it wasn't relative to what I was asking to do. And the only reason I asked Mr. Yates to do it is because he was now in charge of the business group that originally did the investigation. It is just that
the
simple.
review was to look at whether the original investigation had got it right, and whether or not phone hacking was more extensive than originally appeared to be the case. And then you went on to give the Guardian the assurances which you gave them.
Well,
surely, as Mr. Wallace had been an employee of News International, been in the News of the World newsroom at the time as a deputy editor, surely that created a conflict of interest, didn't it? Appearance of one. I mean, members of the public will want to ask this.
Well, of course, your statement is not the case, sir. Can I remind you what I asked Mr. Yates to do? And I read from...
We'll be coming to the investigation in a second.
No, but what was said was not accurate.
Right.
Quite simply, I did not ask Mr. Yates to review it. I asked him to establish the facts of the case and look into that detail, and I would anticipate making a statement later today, perhaps. That's what I said.
On that basis, how did you feel confident then, given that was a very limited review which had been carried out, that's what you knew, how did you feel confident to go to the Guardian and tell them they got it all wrong when they said it was exaggerated?
Mr. Clapson, there was absolutely no reason not to think the original investigation wasn't a success. There were people sent to prison for it, and Mr. Yates looked at it. I asked a senior grade chief constable to have a look at it, and he came to the view that there was nothing new in it.
Right, Sir Paul, let us just move on to those three investigations, because members do want to ask you about that. This is critical, of course, to the other reason why you resigned. In respect to the first investigation, with hindsight, and you mentioned hindsight when you resigned on Sunday, do you accept now that the so-called Heyman-Clark investigation was not as thorough as you would have expected? Otherwise, much of what we were seeing now would have come out then. Do you accept that now?
Firstly, I wouldn't characterise it the Heyman-Clark investigation. I heard the evidence given to this committee. It's quite clear to me that the investigation was run by a man of great integrity, and that's Peter Clark.
Yes.
Secondly, do I accept that...
Are we assuming that Mr. Heyman is not a man of great integrity?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying the man who ran the investigation had great integrity. Mr. Heyman did not run that investigation. That was quite clear to me from the evidence I gave to you.
Yes.
Secondly, do I accept that there's material that is repugnant there that, with hindsight, we would have should have come into an investigation? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Thirdly, do I accept? I listened to Mr. Clark. Do I accept the reasons why he set the narrow parameters? I actually think that is for Mr. Clark to justify, and I do think it's a matter for the judicial review.
Yes. Well, let us go on then to the second review, and Mr. Michael is going to ask questions on this, and the reason why you asked John Yates to review this. This was the 9th of July. We've had evidence from John Yates. He said he took 8 hours to look at the evidence. What were your expectations? When you asked him to do this, how long did you expect him to take?
I had no expectations how long. So again, if I go back to my statement, and even in my letter to you, I missed out the last word in my statement, and it was, I would anticipate making a statement later today, perhaps. I anticipated that statement would be about letting people know where we're up to. But I had no anticipation of what the timescales would be. I asked a senior grade chief constable, which is what an assistant commissioner is, to take another look at it, just take a look and come to a conclusion.
Thank you. Mr. Michael.
I made that statement to Cameron.
Yes, Mr. Michael Vesuvius.
In July 2009, when you asked John Yates to take a fresh look at the material in respect of phone hacking, what did you expect that fresh look to involve?
Well, I'm sorry to say this again, Mr. Michael. It was a big story on Radio 4. I was travelling to Manchester, the Guardian article. I had no knowledge of it. I didn't have a great deal of expectation other than giving it to the person who was in charge of the old business group that investigated it to have a look at what was in that paper to say, is there any reason for us to do anything else? It was that simple.
Did you expect at that time, and in retrospect, would you have expected the material to be reviewed?
No, I wouldn't. Unless there was a reason to doubt the original investigation, and regrettably we didn't have any reason to doubt the original investigation, I would have expected him to look at the new information, if it was new information, coming to light, and come to a view, did it materially alter the position, did it open new lines of inquiry? Mr Yates came to a view that there was no new information in there.
So, let me get this straight. Essentially, you didn't think there was anything to be discovered?
Well, it wasn't whether I thought there was or not. I asked Mr Yates to look at it.
But we now know that there was a mass of material, I underlined the words massive material, which we now know was not reviewed at that time. Does that surprise you in retrospect?
Well, in terms of Mr Yates' explanation, it doesn't surprise me, but these are questions and matters, and I know he's already spoken to you about it, that you have to put to Mr Yates. I'm not surprised that he had no reason to suspect the original investigation wasn't successful. It is very regrettable that that information was there within police possession.
Could you help us a little bit about how decisions are taken then? Because in retrospect, what we know is that the original material was looked at in terms of seeking information for the potential prosecutions that were being pursued. We also know that there was a mass of other material which has, in consequence, led to serious investigations. We heard from Mr Clark that the reason that there wasn't greater investigation of that mass of material was because there was, and accept this point, there was a massive of pressure, massive pressure on him and his officers in terms of dealing with a whole set of potential terrorist threats and investigations. So, in retrospect, do you think that the issue should have been accelerated or escalated to your attention or that of your deputy in order to review the decision not to go further into the examination of the mass of material that was there?
I don't know, unless what we're saying is dishonest, and that is we had no reason to doubt the success of the original investigation.
No, but the original investigation, as we have been told in this committee, was a narrow one. And as I've already indicated in the question, we now know that there was a massive material that may not have been relevant to the individuals being investigated at that time, but was extremely relevant to all the massive concerns that have come out since. At some point, as we understand it, the decision was taken that the resources weren't available to undertake that.
I was going to go on to say, that, which is the second part of if you will, your question, I would have no way of knowing that what the parameters were of that original investigation, or indeed that it was so narrowly drawn, or indeed that it was a resourcing issue. I wasn't involved in that original investigation.
No.
I had no knowledge. So
don't you think that should have been escalated to your attention at that time?
Well, I don't see how it could have been, because I guess neither did anybody else currently have that knowledge.
Okay.
Thank you.
In September 2010, we were asking whether or not there was a fresh investigation. At that time, Mr Yates wasn't able to give us a yes or a no. Did you believe that there was a new investigation going on at that stage?
From recollection, I think Mr Yates would have to confirm this, that there was that Mr Yates was looking again, he was scoping it, because I think that followed disclosures in the New York Times.
He did brief the Mayor of London that, with a very heavy briefing, that there was no new evidence, which meant that the Mayor made his codswallop statement that this was a politically motivated attempt to regenerate this issue. That's what Mr Yates said to the Mayor. Did he say that to you? What did he do? Did he ring you up and tell you the results?
Well, firstly, I don't think Mr Yates said to the Mayor that this is a load of codswallop.
No, that's what the Mayor said.
No, but there was an implication there. I don't think Mr Yates would have said that. Secondly, you'd have to ask Mr Yates what he briefed. I know Mr Yates did brief the Mayor. How heavy it was, I really don't know.
But did Mr Yates brief you?
Did Mr Yates what?
Brief you at the end of the 8 hours?
He gave me, I heard his
A
assurance.
verbal briefing?
Well, I think it would have been a verbal briefing. I was in Manchester and he was in London.
So he rang you and told you, I've tried to establish the facts, that's what your press release says, and this is my result.
From memory, I don't know whether